In America, the first newspaper appeared in Boston in 1690. It was published without authority and it was automatically put to an end. After that incident, the way we got our news changed forever. People immediately started seeing how impactful putting certain opinions in the newspaper could be used to be able to change other people's perspective of different situations. The demand of newspaper increased because of the change of demographics in the United States at the time, since more people were spread out, so they needed to get the information out to the public. Newspapers became so popular that about 11,314 different papers were recorded by the year of 1880. The reason for this was because the metal printing press was created. Something that became popular in the 1890s was yellow journalism. Yellow journalism was a newspaper style that emphasized high-interest stories, crime news, headlines, and serious reports that exposed corruption, which usually ended up in business and government. As the newspapers became more interesting, they eventually started charging people for the newspaper. People started feeding off all the stories that were being put off in the newspaper. They started demanding more news and they wanted it as soon as possible. Because of this, the way we got our news started to change dramatically. We suddenly didn't have to wait till a certain time to be able to receive the news. Now you're able to find out information with just one click away.
During the 1700s, when America was still under British rule, the King of England tried to implement the Stamp Act. Because of newspapers, it was clear that many opposed the tax and it became unenforceable. The Founding Fathers understood that newspapers had an important role, so they created the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. In 1798, President John Adams signed the Aliens and Sedition Acts. It outlawed false, scandalous, or malicious writing about the government or its officials, but the law expired by 1803. Then came the telegraph. According to the Washington Post, it was helpful letting journalists in different parts of the country send information back to their offices, and because it was expensive, it helped carry the most important parts of the news: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Yellow journalism came around the 1800s. It used to be just an exaggeration, but then became deceptive. In 1801, Benjamin Day created the New York Sun, and it sold for a penny instead of 6 cents. It created a new journalism, focusing on crime and human interest stories, but also made up their stories. The circulation of New York Sun rose from 5,000 to 15,000, according to the Washington Post. In 1917, the Sedition Act was enacted and was designed to limit unrestrained speech. That same year, the National Civil Liberties Bureau was established to defend freedom of the press. Finally, in 1922, the American Society of Newspaper Editors was established and issued a code of ethics. According to the Washington Post, those were: freedom from all obligations except that of fidelity to the public interest is vital, and by every consideration of good faith, a newspaper is constrained to be truthful. They also stated that by the 1900s, chains of newspapers were being bought. Because space on newspapers were expensive, advertisers sold their advertisements to large chains and pushed smaller newspapers out of business. By 1971, half of the U.S. dailies were chain-owned, and by 1990, it was 75%. Newspapers have evolved greatly since it started in the 17th century, and it hasn't stopped. Now audiences are preferring to read their news online, and newspapers expanded to publishing digitally to cater to the growing market.
Online newspapers appeal to a diverse audience among the news hounds, the computer savvy, and the younger generation, all who see the internet as a preferred way to access information and news. In the early 21st century, nearly all the world's major newspapers began publishing online editions of their newspapers to gain a larger audience. Many newspapers made their web editions available for free because the advertising revenue, combined with lower printing and distribution costs, could make up for the lower subscription fees. Online ad revenues continue to soar and currently account for just 5% of all newspaper company revenue. According to News Media Alliance, the digital audience engaged with newspaper content reached a new peak in August 2015, totaling 179.3 million visitors. Now consider the power of the traditional newspaper. In the past, papers were responsible for bringing down a president and starting a war. and the papers were catering mainly to a local audience. Now consider the power of the new medium and its potential to reach millions of people worldwide. When comparing a traditional newspaper to an online newspaper, the overall layout remains the same. There's still a headliner that is meant to get the audience's attention, but the biggest similarity is what news is. We decided in 18th century that newspapers are about recent or important events, and basically we have stuck to that and have no intentions of changing that.